King Charles's voice echoed across the Grand Hall of the Commonwealth Forum in London, a room heavy with chandeliers, velvet drapes, and the ghosts of an empire that refused to admit it was gone. Delegates from across the world sat in polished rows, waiting for the discussion on global cooperation and historical responsibility to begin. But from the moment the king stepped to the podium, his tone carried something sharper than diplomacy, something old, imperial, confident. "Let us remember," Charles said, clasping his hands behind his back, "that the crown played a crucial role in building civilization as we know it today." Murmurs rippled across the room. Some nodded politely, others stiffened. And one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, lifted his head slowly, his expression unreadable. Traoré didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He simply watched, like a lion waiting for the right second to move. Charles continued, "Without the institutions, systems, and order introduced by Britain, much of the world would look very different, far less stable, far less prosperous." This time, the room didn't just murmur. It went silent. Everyone knew what the king was implying. Everyone knew who he was looking at. Traoré straightened his posture. The cameras found him instantly. Commentators, journalists, diplomats, they all leaned forward as if anticipating a blow. Because no African leader on the planet answered colonial arrogance the way Traoré did. And Charles had just handed him a loaded weapon. The moderator cleared his throat and gestured toward Traoré. "President Traoré, would you like to respond?" Traoré rose slowly, calmly, with the resolve of a soldier who had seen war and understood the weight of history in a way a king never could. His boots clicked softly against the marble floor as he approached the microphone. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment. He rested his palms on the podium. "Your Majesty," he began, voice low, steady, dangerous, "you say the crown built civilization." He paused. The world held its breath. "Then let us speak," Traoré continued, "about what it was built on." Another pause, colder this time. Sharper. Then Traoré delivered the sentence that would explode across headlines within the hour. "Because if the crown built civilization," he leaned forward, "it built it on African bones." Gasps filled the hall. Cameras flashed. Charles's face froze. And the real confrontation had only just begun. The room inside Buckingham Palace shifted the moment Traoré stepped forward. The king had expected a polite African statesman, someone cautious, diplomatic, humble. Instead, he was met with a presence that carried the weight of continents and the confidence of a soldier who had walked through storms greater than crowns. Charles straightened his spine, gripping his cane more tightly, unwilling to let the cameras see the flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "You speak strongly for a man whose nation was built yesterday," Charles said in a sharp, mocking tone. The courtiers behind him nodded obediently, their expressions carved from centuries of inherited arrogance. To them, Traoré was an intruder in a world they still believed belonged to them. Traoré didn't blink. "My nation is older than your crown," he answered softly, too softly. The kind of softness that made everyone freeze. Charles frowned. "We built civilization," he declared, lifting his chin proudly. "We carried progress across the world. Without the crown, there would be no roads, no trade, no order." The room waited for Traoré to bow, at least verbally. Instead, he stepped closer. "Everything you built," he said, "was built on African bones." A whisper rippled through the hall. A guard swallowed. A secretary almost dropped his tablet. Even the chandeliers seemed to sway with the weight of the words. Charles's lips tightened. "Watch your tone." Traoré tilted his head. "Your ancestors never did." Silence. Thick. Violent. The kind that turns history from a story into a weapon. Traoré continued, "You claim you built civilization. Yet you forget who provided the bricks, our gold, our labor, our lives." He pointed calmly to the golden decorations lining the walls. "Even your palace shines with Africa." For the first time, Charles looked away. Traoré delivered the final blow. "You built an empire with our blood, your Majesty. Today, Africa builds its future without yours." Everyone in the room knew it. The king had lost the first round. The tension inside Buckingham Palace thickened as soon as Traoré finished speaking. A silence fell over the ornate hall. Not the respectful silence that royalty expects, but the stunned silence of men realizing their authority has just been challenged, and possibly dismantled. King Charles shifted in his seat. For a moment, the mask of royal calm slipped, revealing something raw beneath, confusion, and something dangerously close to fear. No one spoke to a British monarch like that, not diplomats, not generals, not presidents. Yet here stood Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier from a nation the crown once tried to bend, speaking to him with the confidence of an equal, or perhaps a superior. Charles forced a thin smile. "Captain Traoré," he began, choosing each word with ceremonial caution, "you speak of bones and burdens. But history is complicated. The crown has brought progress, order, and—" Traoré cut him off with a raised hand. "Progress built for whom, your majesty? Order for whom? Because from where Africa stood, all we saw were ships full of chains, mines full of blood, and kings wearing wealth that wasn't theirs." A murmur rippled across the royal advisors in the room. Some bristled, others avoided eye contact entirely. Charles straightened. "You must understand." "I understand perfectly," Traoré replied. His voice was low, steady, unshakable. Africa was never poor. It was made poor. And now, the same powers who drained it want to lecture us about civilization. One of the advisors snapped, "This tone is unacceptable." Traoré didn't even glance at him. "If the truth threatens you, that's not my tone. That's your conscience." Charles exhaled, long, slow, controlled, gripping the armrests of his chair. "You come here demanding respect, yet you show none to this institution." Traoré stepped forward just slightly, enough to shift the air in the room. "Respect isn't inherited," he said. "It's earned. And Africa has spent centuries earning what was stolen from us." The king's jaw tightened. For the first time in the meeting, his royal posture broke. Traoré continued, each word cutting deeper. "You say your empire built civilization. But your empire lived off African bones. And now, when Africa stands tall, you tremble, because you know the world is changing." Silence. No one dared breathe. Then Traoré delivered the final blow. "Your Majesty, the age of kings ruling continents they've never stepped foot on is over. Africa is not your memory. Africa is your reckoning." Charles looked down. He had no response. King Charles's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't often that someone spoke to a monarch, a British monarch, with that kind of unflinching certainty. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to shrink, tightening around the weight of Traoré's words. Ministers froze. Advisors exchanged glances. Even the cameras, silently recording, seemed to lean closer. Charles straightened his back, choosing to hide his discomfort behind a thin, brittle smile. "You speak boldly for a young man," he said, folding his hands. "But boldness is not wisdom. The crown has endured centuries. Empires rise and fall around us." Traoré nodded slowly. "Empires do fall," he said. "Especially the ones built on stolen blood." That sentence rippled through the room like a shockwave. An aide to the king stepped forward, whispering urgently in Charles's ear, but the monarch lifted a hand to silence him. His pride had been challenged, and he refused to back away. "Young man," Charles said, forcing a regal tone, "the British Empire brought civilization, governance, institutions." Traoré cut him off without hesitation. "You brought chains." The silence that followed was different, heavier, sharper, almost suffocating. Traoré continued, his voice low but resonant. "Civilization built on graves is not civilization. Governance built on forced labor is not governance. And institutions built on looted wealth are nothing but monuments to hypocrisy." Charles's jaw tightened. No one had ever spoken to him this way, not presidents, not prime ministers, not global leaders who usually bent under the unspoken weight of the crown's legacy. But Traoré. Traoré wasn't playing by the old rules. "You misunderstand history," Charles insisted. "We guided nations." "No," Traoré replied. You guided yourself to our gold, our diamonds, our land. Africa didn't need your guidance. You needed our resources. Several African diplomats in the room exchanged proud, almost relieved glances. Someone had finally said what generations had been too intimidated to speak aloud. Charles exhaled deeply, gripping the edges of his chair. You speak like a man who wants conflict. Traoré leaned forward, eyes steady, unshakable. I speak like a man whose people are done being trampled. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Advisors rushed to intervene. But it was too late. The world had already heard the line that would dominate headlines. On African bones, Your Majesty. And Africa will no longer carry you. King Charles straightened his back, trying to recover the royal posture he felt slipping from him. But the more he attempted to regain control, the more Traoré's presence eclipsed him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was the quiet, iron-willed authority of a man who didn't need centuries of empire to stand tall. Mr. Traoré, Charles said, forcing a diplomatic tone, you speak as though history is a crime scene. Empires rise and fall. That is simply the nature of the world. Traoré's eyes hardened. No, he replied, what fell were nations you drained. What rose were palaces built on exploited hands. A ripple moved through the room. Every advisor shifted, every royal guard stiffened, and even the chandelier above them seemed to freeze. Charles tried to respond, but Traoré stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a certainty that made the floor itself feel like it belonged to him. You say Britain built civilization. He paused. But whose labor carved your monuments? Whose minerals powered your factories? Whose blood fed your empire? Charles inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. You speak boldly for a man whose nation was never part of the great powers. Traoré smiled, slowly, dangerously. And you speak proudly for a man standing on an empire held together by apologies and museum theft. The king blinked. The blow landed deeper than he expected. Traoré continued, voice low and unstoppable. Africa isn't what your textbooks described. It isn't a colony waiting for guidance. It isn't a continent waiting for rescue. We are not the shadows of your empire. We are the morning you hoped would never come. For the first time, King Charles looked genuinely uncertain. Traoré leaned in just enough for the king to hear him fully. You built your throne on African bones. And now Africa is standing up, not to bow, but to collect what was taken. The silence that followed was thick, electric, and final. King Charles's composure cracked for the first time. His breath caught in his throat, and he blinked slowly, as if trying to reset the moment, trying to convince himself that he had not just been challenged by a man half his age, from a nation Britain once believed it controlled. The royal advisors behind him shifted nervously, exchanging glances that begged one unspoken question: had the king lost control of the room? Traoré sensed the tremor instantly. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. Silence itself became a weapon in his hands, sharp, deliberate, humiliating. Finally, Charles leaned forward. Young man, he said, his voice tightening, you seem to misunderstand the weight of history. Traoré smiled faintly. I understand it perfectly, he replied. I just refuse to carry Britain's version of it. A ripple shot through the hall. Charles straightened, trying to reclaim the authority slipping from his fingers. We built civilization. We brought order to places that had none. We gave structure to the world. Traoré didn't flinch. You built empires, he corrected calmly. And you built them on African bones. The king froze. Traoré continued, you speak of civilization as if it were a gift. But Africa had kingdoms before Britain had plumbing. Africa had scholars while your ancestors thought the earth was flat. And Africa had gold, ivory, philosophy, mathematics, long before colonizers came to extract, erase, and rename everything. One of Charles's advisors stepped forward, whispering, Your Majesty, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. But Traoré raised a hand, stopping him. No. Let the world hear this. Let them hear what Africa remembers. He turned back to Charles. You claim you built civilization, Traoré said quietly. But what you really built was a shadow, a system that still believes Africans should stay small so Europe can feel tall. The king swallowed. And now, Traoré added, you want to return to Africa. Return to what? The resources? The influence? The illusion of control? The hall fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Traoré leaned forward, his voice now a low, dangerous whisper. If the British Crown ever steps foot on African soil with colonial intentions again, it won't be Africa that remembers history. It will be history that remembers you. Charles's jaw tightened. He had no comeback. No script, no polished line, no imperial authority left to stand on. Traoré had stripped the throne down to its bones. The tension inside Buckingham's private council chamber had evolved into something far sharper than diplomacy. King Charles, who moments earlier carried himself with royal certainty, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Traoré's words, sharp, unyielding, and historically precise, were cutting through the polished arrogance that had coated the room. Charles tried to regain control. You speak boldly, he said, his voice low but trembling at the edges. But boldness does not erase history, Captain Traoré. The crown shaped the world. We brought order, structure, and governance to lands that had none. Traoré lifted his eyes slowly, and for a moment, the chamber felt smaller, too small to contain the weight of what was coming. Order, he repeated, almost whispering. You call the graves of my ancestors order? You call stolen gold, stolen land, stolen people, structure? One of the royal advisors stepped forward, attempting to intervene. Mr. Traoré, perhaps we should. Traoré raised a hand. The advisor stopped immediately, as if the air itself commanded silence. No, Traoré said. Let him answer. Charles swallowed. This wasn't the direction he had expected the meeting to take. Africa was chaotic, he argued. Divided. We brought unity through empire. Traoré leaned forward, eyes unwavering. You didn't unite Africa, you carved it open. And every border you drew bled for decades. You built an empire, yes, but you built it with bones you chose not to see. The king blinked rapidly, taken aback. And here you stand, Traoré continued, claiming ownership of the very civilizations your empire spent centuries dismantling. Mali. Ghana. Songhai. Empires older than yours. Richer than yours. More advanced than yours. The room froze. Even the hum of the heating system felt muted. Charles exhaled sharply. You speak as if the past can be undone. Traoré shook his head. The past doesn't need to be undone. It needs to be acknowledged. And you cannot lead conversations about the future while you deny the truth of what built your throne. For the first time, King Charles didn't respond. He simply stared, drawn, challenged, unsettled. Traoré's voice softened, but his words only grew heavier. You stand on foundations made from what you took. I stand on foundations built from what survived you. The chamber absorbed the silence that followed, thick and unmoving. Charles's advisors exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to interrupt or flee. Traoré finally leaned back in his chair. And that, he said calmly, is why Africa rises. Not to destroy you, but to remind you that you never owned what you tried to bury. The hall inside Buckingham Palace had fallen so silent that even the cameras seemed afraid to breathe. King Charles, who had begun the meeting with all the stiffness of centuries-old monarchy, now sat frozen, his knuckles white against the polished armrest. Ibrahim Traoré, however, remained steady, his eyes sharp, unblinking, completely unmoved by royal theatrics. Outside, the London rain hammered against the old stone walls, as if echoing the storm that had erupted inside the palace. A few royal advisors exchanged worried glances. They had expected a diplomatic visit, a symbolic courtesy. Not a confrontation that cracked through the floor of British confidence. King Charles finally broke the silence. "You dare accuse the crown," he said slowly, "of building its legacy on bones?" Traoré leaned forward. "Not accuse. State fact." A royal guard swallowed hard. Even he felt the shift, the sensation that history was being rewritten right in front of him. Charles stiffened. "You speak as though Africa holds no responsibility for its state." Traoré raised a hand gently. "Not to interrupt out of disrespect, but to stop a lie from spreading. Africa's state, as you call it, is the result of chains your empire forged. Borders you drew. Families you ripped apart. Wealth you shipped across oceans." The king's jaw tightened. But Traoré wasn't done. "You want Africa to bow for stability, for order, for tradition. But all those words are masks. The truth is simpler, you fear an Africa that stands." A whisper stirred across the room. It wasn't shock anymore. It was recognition. Traoré rose from his chair, his presence towering even without a crown. "You say the British Empire built civilization," he continued. "But civilization is not built on stolen gold, whipped backs, and silent graves." The king's eyes flickered, a moment of exposed truth, quickly masked. "And now," Traoré said softly, "you want to return to Africa not to heal it, but to reclaim control. But Africa is not your inheritance. It is not your museum. Not your crown jewel to retrieve." He took one step closer, enough for the king to truly feel the weight of the new world. "You ask what Africa wants," Traoré continued. "Here is your answer: Africa wants justice. Africa wants respect. Africa wants every grave you buried in silence to finally speak." The room felt smaller, almost suffocating, but Traoré stood as if the air belonged to him. "And if you truly believe the empire can rise again," he said, voice steady and lethal, "then try. Come back to Africa. And see who returns." The king had no response, only silence, only fear, only the realization that the world he knew was gone. The room felt colder now, as if the weight of history itself had settled over the polished marble floor. King Charles stood stiffly, jaw tightened, struggling to maintain the royal composure expected of a monarch. But the cracks were showing. Every exchange with Traoré had chipped away at his carefully constructed image of old-world authority. Traoré, however, looked untouched, steady, grounded, unmoved by the grandeur surrounding him. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal that the next words would not be diplomacy, but truth. "You speak of civilization," Traoré said, his voice low yet sharp enough to slice through the silence. "But you never say whose bones built it. Whose lands paid for it. Whose people were crushed beneath it." The king exhaled through his nose, defensive irritation flickering across his face. "History is complicated," he muttered. "History is clear," Traoré replied instantly. "The only people who call it complicated are the ones who benefited from the suffering." A ripple of discomfort spread across the British officials in the room. Traoré didn't let the moment slip. "You want influence in Africa again? You want to return?" He shook his head lightly. "But Africa has already returned to itself." Charles's eyes narrowed. "You think you can rewrite the global order?" Traoré smiled, not with arrogance, but with certainty. "We're not rewriting it. We're correcting it." The king's fingers curled around the armrest of his chair as if holding on to centuries of entitlement. "The crown has endured wars, revolutions, empires rising and falling. We are not so easily dismissed." "That's the problem," Traoré answered. "You believe endurance is the same as righteousness." The king swallowed, audibly. Traoré stood fully now, and the room followed his movement with tense eyes. Africa is not your museum. Not your memory. Not your market. And certainly not your empire. Then he delivered the line that froze even the air itself. You built your civilization on African bones. Now Africa will build its future without yours. The king looked away, because there was nothing left for him to say. The hall was no longer a royal chamber, it felt like a battlefield. King Charles stood frozen, his polished authority cracked by the weight of Traoré's words. Cameras flashed, aides whispered, diplomats shifted in their seats. Everyone sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding, a monarch who ruled empires, being dismantled by a soldier from a nation those empires once tried to erase. Traoré rose slowly, not with aggression, but with a calm that made his presence even more terrifying to those who feared truth. He approached the center of the room, every step deliberate, every breath steady, like a man who knew history was watching. Your Majesty, Traoré began, his voice steady, you speak of civilization as though Africa played no part in it. He paused, letting silence expose the lie. You speak of empire as though its foundations were noble. But we know what built those foundations: labor taken, land stolen, names buried, cultures silenced. Charles tightened his jaw. Those were different times, he muttered. Traoré shook his head. Time doesn't cleanse bones. Gasps echoed across the room. You claim the crown built civilization, Traoré continued, yet every museum in your country displays the evidence of what was taken to do so. Gold that isn't yours. Art that wasn't yours. Histories you rewrote. And people, millions of them, whose lives shaped your wealth but never shared in it. The king tried to interrupt, but Traoré didn't allow it. You want Africa to forget, he said. But forgetting is a luxury only the oppressor enjoys. A hush fell like a blanket. Even the bodyguards didn't move. Traoré stepped closer, close enough that the king finally blinked, overwhelmed by a force he could not dominate. You told me Britain built civilization, he said quietly. But civilization is not built on graveyards. It is built on justice. On dignity. And on truth. Then, with the gentlest, deadliest calm, Traoré delivered the line that would echo across continents. You built empires on African bones. Now Africa is rebuilding itself on its own terms, and this time, Your Majesty, we won't let anyone stand on our backs again. The king's face collapsed into something between defeat and realization, a man forced to confront a truth his throne could no longer protect him from. Traoré turned away, leaving Charles standing in the ruins of the myth he had tried to defend. History, for the first time in centuries, had shifted away from the crown, and toward the continent it once sought to control.